Tonight we're in Tunbridge Wells. Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Matt Hancock, appointed Health Secretary nearly 2 years ago by Theresa May, kept in the job by Boris Johnson. He now faces one of the biggest challenges for his department, the government and the country. Former Foreign Secretary and Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and an MP since 1974, Margaret Beckett. Layla Moran, Education Spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats, rumoured to be a candidate for the leadership of the party. Tim Stanley, journalist, broadcaster and columnist for the Daily Telegraph. And doctor, writer and TV presenter on numerous health programmes, including CBBC's hugely popular Operation Ouch, Xander van Tullekin. Welcome to our panel, to the audience here and, of course, to you at home. Remember, you can join in the usual fashion on social media at BBC Question Time. Now, it's pretty obvious, I think, to all of us here and to you at home that there is one big subject dominating the conversation at the moment. And having seen all the questions that you have submitted here, there's no doubt the coronavirus and its impact is what people here want to talk about. So we're going to do things just a little differently this evening. We have the Health Secretary with us. Matt, we're very pleased to have you here. So we're going to take a run of a quick fire, if you like, Q&A type questions so we can hear the practical concerns of some of you here, which will hopefully reflect those of people at home as well. We will, of course, do the politics and the challenges of the government. So, not going to get off quite that easy, Matt. But first of all, let's start with a more general question about coronavirus. From Jill Pullin.
How afraid of coronavirus should we be?
Matt.
Well, clearly, coronavirus is a huge challenge to the country. And on behalf of everyone, I want to send our deepest condolences to the family and to the loved ones of the patient who died today with coronavirus. And I'm sure that that will be a worrying moment for lots of people, and understandably so. And I feel the responsibility deeply for getting the government response to this right. The government aren't the only people who need to respond. It's actually something all of us can play a part in. And it's perfectly reasonable for people to be worried. Now, of course, for the majority of people, if they catch coronavirus, then it'll be a mild, relatively mild disease, and the vast majority will fully recover. And so from that point of view, for most people, this will be something akin to getting the flu if they get it. But obviously it's also having some very significant effects, both on the economy, in terms of people, how they manage their daily lives. And then for a small proportion of people, we estimate around 1% of those who catch it, then it is fatal. And so it is a very serious consideration. And the thing that makes it more difficult is that this virus, this disease, is new. And that means that none of us have the natural antibodies that we have to something like a flu. So it is a serious problem for the country, and all of us need to play our part and can play our part in making sure that we as a country and as a world respond as well as we possibly can.
And Jill, can I ask, how worried are you?
I'm not personally particularly worried because I feel that I don't fall into the category where I should be majorly concerned. From what I have read, that it will be, for the majority of us, severe cold or flu-like symptoms, and yet a lot of what you read implies that we should almost be barricading the doors. OK. Well,
we're going to get into more specific things in a moment. Xand, how afraid should we be?
I think it's such a good question, Jill, because everyone I know is wondering how to react to the news that we're getting. The first death today, 100 cases, how serious is it? I guess I would say there is an urgency, and the fact that COVID is dominating the headlines is because every single person in the UK should be changing their behaviour today. The most important thing is hand washing. Now, hand washing will not reduce your chances of catching it to zero, but it will dramatically slow the spread. And slowing the spread is very urgent because the number of cases doubles every few days. So a few days ago we had 40, 50 cases, now we have 100. In a few days' time we will have 200. And that doubling may well keep on going. And as it doubles, as Matt said, a small proportion of those people, not necessarily the small proportion that die, but maybe 5%, maybe 10% will need intensive care or at least a high dependency unit. And those beds are in short supply at the moment in the NHS, as they always are. And so the more we can spread things out, the more likely it is that we can provide high quality care to everyone that needs it and keep mortality as low as possible. That's the urgency. So everyone should be invested. I mean, there are other things you can do. You should be hygienic in terms of catching and killing sneezes and coughs, in terms of wiping surfaces. I think everyone should be self-monitoring, and if you're concerned, even more than normal, avoiding infecting other people. And then I would say, I know Matt and I probably don't really disagree with this. I think the government has been very, very sensible at providing good quality evidence-based information. Personally, I like not handshaking, not because it may in itself stop the spread enormously, but because it makes you think. When you walk into a room, we all just met kind of backstage, and I wouldn't shake anyone's hand, and it made it intensely awkward, and everyone was suddenly talking about coronavirus, and I quite like that. Then you start to get out the alcohol gel and think about it. There's loads of other things you can do. You can do air kisses, you can do a little hug, you can do a bow, a wave, a foot tap, a knuckle bump, however you want to greet people, but all of it, I like an elbow bump, but all of that makes people conscious of hygiene. So yeah, everyone should be invested, no one should panic.
And Xander will be demonstrating all those things before the end of the program.
Can't do them all at once.
Margaret, Jill's asking how afraid should we be?
I don't think we should be afraid, but I think we should be wary and cautious and look for sound information. I mean, one of the things that strikes me forcibly is that this is going to illuminate all the problems we've already got in our health service, which we know is underfunded and all those things. And it will bring a lot of that home. And so I think this is going to be, apart from anything else, it's going to be a period where people can learn about each other, about what the country's problems are, what we need to do to resolve them. And that, I think, will in itself be important. But so I don't think we should go about in fear and dread, but I don't think we ought to be silly either.
Tim?
I noticed that all the loo roll is gone in my local supermarket, so really people are, and so is the hand gel as well. I don't know why people have gone for the loo roll, I don't even want to know, but it's all gone. You can't get for love nor there'll be a black market in it soon. I think the government's getting it about right, which is to walk this fine line between getting people ready and getting people conscious of the way they're behaving, but also not causing too much alarm, because there's always a risk that you generate so much alarm that that actually does more damage than the virus itself, at least economically. We don't want our way of life to be changed forever. That's always what one is conscious about trying to avoid. I want to be able to go back to shaking hands. I'm not going to walk around doing that all day. I want things to go back to normal as soon as possible, and therefore any short-term inconvenience that we have to accept, fair enough. But the goal is to keep calm, carry on, not get hysterical, because that's kind of what defines Britain.
Layla?
Well, I think like you, for myself, I'm not actually that worried. I'm young and healthy, and if I get it, there's a very good chance I'll be okay. But I am worried for my particularly elderly grandparents, people who are more vulnerable, people who perhaps don't have the same resilience financially as I do. I've been doing a lot of work in the last few days, writing to Matt, in fact, about statutory sick pay, thinking of those who have jobs on 0 hours contract in the gig economy, who have to actually think hard about, do I go to work today, or do I do the right thing for other people, which is to self-isolate if they have those symptoms and they've been in contact with someone. And all credit to the government, they've been listening and they have now changed those rules. So we are trying to all work together on this, and I think that's really important, that actually politicians at a time like this do our jobs and talk about the most vulnerable constituents that we have. The other people I really do worry about are people like the homeless. And I was talking to people in the sector today who are concerned, and I say this talking to Matt, they haven't had guidance about what to do for people, particularly rough sleepers. And you have to think, if you don't have a home, how do you self-isolate? And I see he's writing that down, and I hope you're going to take that back, because actually at a time like this, we perform a really important job, which is to ask the right questions on behalf of the people that we serve. And the job of the government, I think, is to respond and listen.
Okay. there's a lot of very practical questions that many of you have asked. So I'm going to do a kind of, for want of a better phrase, a kind of quick fire round to you, Matt,
okay,
if I may. So a quick question and a reasonably brief answer. I want to get as many in as I can.
Yeah.
Jim Doherty, do you want to kick us off?
With the first death today, should we now be preventing large gatherings at sports events and theatres?
Well, we're looking into the exact science of what the approach should be as the numbers grow. We're still in the phase where we're trying to contain this virus, but also, exactly as Xan said, delaying the onset has a big benefit in terms of the impact on the NHS. Actually, the more we look at the science of this particular virus, the more it is clear that the large-scale events are not necessarily as big spreaders as a lot of people think. And the reason for that is the way that this virus transmits is through it's respiratory, so it's through close proximity. So if you're, say, outdoors, then and you have the virus, then you would still only be affecting the people near to you. So the most important thing is to get the messages that people who have the virus and have the symptoms need to self-isolate. So following the science is absolutely at the heart of the government's response. And if I just also respond to Layla's point, because she was complimentary about how the government is handling this, I would also say across party in Parliament, I've never seen Parliament respond to something like this, absolutely coming together to try to find the right scientific response to this crisis and try to bring the country together.
Another question from Thomas Bates.
How will the government support those who self-isolate due to coronavirus who aren't entitled to statutory sick pay, such as those on 0 hours contracts?
Absolutely.
Thomas, this is an incredibly important question, and we've said that people should not be penalised for doing the right thing. So we will change the rules on statutory sick pay, but we're also working on making sure that people who are, say, self-employed or they're in an employment contract that doesn't allow them to get statutory sick pay because they don't earn the minimum amount, maybe because they don't work full time, to make sure that they get the support they need as well. Because if we
financial support from the government.
Yes, because if we as government are asking people to self-isolate, then they shouldn't be penalised for doing the right thing, which is good for them, but good for the whole community.
And when can we expect an announcement on that?
Well, the Prime Minister made the announcement yesterday in broad terms, and I'm working with the DWP Secretary and the Business Secretary to get the exact rules of that right, and then they'll go through Parliament.
OK. Andrew Fenton.
If I get coronavirus, how should I self-isolate from my family?
Well, this is another incredibly important question. People should try to self-isolate from their families. So not only go home, try not to go out, for instance, shopping. Definitely don't use public transport. But within your home, you should also try to isolate. Now, look, I'm the father of 3 children. I understand that that can be difficult, and some people have caring responsibilities. But as much as possible, stay on your own, even within your own home.
So practically things like sharing a bathroom, a kitchen.
Well, so long as you wash your hands and wipe down surfaces that you use, you can take these precautions. Obviously, there are practicalities, but the strong advice is to, as much as you possibly can, even with within your own home, if you're self-isolating, keep yourself to yourself.
OK. Nicola Pyle.
The media seem to help create panic buying. How do we stop causing shortages caused by this?
Yes, we've already heard about the loo roll, haven't we?
Well, there's absolutely no need for individuals to go around buying more than they need. And in fact, look, part of the response to this has to be us coming together. We are, after all, a herd. It's the biology that is causing the problem. And so, obviously, the very, very strong advice from the scientists, from the medics, is that people should not go about buying more than they need.
I went to the supermarket today, no dry pasta at all, no toilet rolls, as you said earlier, Tim. People are panic buying. I mean, there's no paracetamol, anything like that you can get in the supermarkets.
Well, I understand that, but what I'd say is that the government has supplies of the key things that are needed, and within the food supply, we are absolutely confident that people will, that there won't be a problem there. And crucially, we're working with the supermarkets to make sure that if people are self-isolating, then we'll be able to get the food and supplies that they need.
Louis Mays, where? Yes.
As a student about to sit A-levels for a place at university, what will happen if our exams are cut short by the coronavirus?
Well, this is another important one. We're doing everything we can to prevent that happening, subject to keeping people safe. So the overall principle is that we've got to, first priority absolutely is to keep people safe, and I feel that very keenly. But also we want to minimise the social and economic disruption. Hence, unlike some other countries that have done this, the scientific advice is really clear not to close schools and colleges. And the message is to schools is don't close unless you've specifically had the advice from Public Health England to do so. And then as we come into exam season, obviously we're monitoring that very closely, and the Education Department is doing, I think, a fantastic job in keeping the school system running. But as we get to exams, we will do everything we can to allow that to proceed. But of course, you'll understand that if we have to take action to keep people safe, then we are prepared to do that.
Let's take one more before I throw it open to, from Oliver Carter.
What are the government doing to tackle the wait time from coronavirus tests?
Yes, the tests. So getting the test results back is really obviously important if you're waiting for tests. And I know friends of mine who've had the tests, and lots of people have talked to me about it. We're getting a new tech solution in to be able to get the results back to people much quicker. And we've got a lot of people on it, so I get it. And we're trying to make sure that happens as quickly as possible.
Okay, now I'm going to go to the audience for more things. Is there anything that any of you are sort of burning to yes, Layla, you want to come in?
Just simply to say, I mean, I think now is a time more important than ever that we listen to experts, and thank goodness for experts, and thank goodness for scientists. And we just all have to be mindful of what we're reading on Facebook, what we're reading on Twitter, what we might read in certain newspapers. And one lady was asking, you know, newspapers are partly responsible for panic buying. You guys have a choice. You can choose to buy them or not as well if you see that they are stoking this. We have to be calm, but listen to the people who actually know what they're talking about, epidemiologists, others, doctors who know this stuff. And I know that I'm certainly going to be encouraging all my friends and family to do that. Margaret?
I completely agree with that, but I think it's really, really important that we have good communications. And I know Matt and everyone in the government and everybody across politics is aware of that. There have got to be trusted voices, and people have got to listen to them and to be able to trust them. And we've also got to learn as much as we can from what's happening internationally, even if sometimes it's what not to do.
Okay. Now, I'm going to take another named question here, but then do get your hands up if there's things you want to say, because I know from all the questions I saw come in when you arrived earlier on this evening, there are a lot of things that you want to ask. But let me just go now to Christian Patel.
How do you expect an already strained NHS to cope, given 1 in 12 NHS posts are vacant, and healthcare professionals would need to self-isolate for 14 days if exposed to the virus?
Are you a healthcare worker, by any chance?
Yes, I am, yeah.
And what's your view on this?
I'm very worried, actually, because on the wards, on a day-to-day basis, we're already at breaching points, and I worry that an asymptomatic patient with the virus infects the wards, and we lose 50% or even 25% of our workforce, and that I can't see how we would be able to deliver a safe service for patients.
Right. Xander, from your experience in the health
service? It's such an interesting question. I suppose, in thinking about this, my first instinct is to have a massive go at the Tory government, the last 10 years of austerity, the fact that the NHS has been starved of cash and starved of staff and resources for so long. In fact, I think this represents such a significant burden that no matter what health service a country builds, the threat of pandemic disease will always produce diseases that will overwhelm a normally functioning health service. And so although I share all your concerns about the NHS and the state of it at the moment, our ability to provide the level of intensive care beds, which is the main issue, because we don't have a cure for coronavirus. So if you come into hospital and you're just poorly, you're not going to be achieving anything more than you could at home. So the vast majority of people stay at home, get a box set, have some lemon and honey, and convalesce. If you're deteriorating and you go into hospital, the decision is whether or not you need intensive care, things like ventilation, and that is where, in that sort of 5% who need that urgent care, that very extreme care, that is where the lives are saved. Those beds will be, in a major crisis like this, those beds are not going to be just drawn from the normal pool of intensive care beds. I think, and Matt, of course, will know much, much more about this than me, but they will be drawn from the major incident plans and the big catastrophe plans that are drawn up at the moment. So although I share your massive concerns about the future of the NHS, in this particular case, I think the immediate resources come from elsewhere. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely reasonable. Look, we acknowledge that we need more people in the NHS. There's a record number of people currently working today in the NHS, and I'm really pleased to see those numbers have been going up recently. But Xander's right that the challenge in the NHS at the moment is that demand has been going up, and something like this will add to that. But I would say this as well, which is that the NHS is unbelievably good at responding to crises. I mean, they do it in a small way every day in all of the A&Es across the country, and it may have to reconfigure in some ways if this does become a pandemic. That has to be clinically led so that the doctors can decide what is the best way to save lives, and I will give them the absolute the freedom to make the right decisions, and we're also making more money available if they need it. But you know, it is less about the money, it's more about how do you use the resources of the nation best to support people to get through what will be a very challenging period.
Okay, lots of hands up. Let me come to them. Yes, the woman there in the blue top.
I don't think there's enough being done to prevent the disease coming into the country. When you travel to Asia or to the Middle East at the moment, you're met at airports with your temperature's taken and your symptoms are monitored, and then if you've got symptoms, I don't know exactly what happens, but you've certainly been recorded, or the case would have been recorded. In this country, you arrive at Heathrow, you arrive at Gatwick, nothing is done. You might be given a piece of paper saying, call 111. You get in a taxi, you go to a hotel, there's no hand sanitizer anywhere. In Asia and other parts of the world, they're all over the place. So it just seems that for anyone coming into this country, nothing's done at the airport, so it's just going to spread because there's no prevention.
Okay, let me take a few points and I'll come back to you, Matt, afterwards. Yes, the woman there. Yes.
This presumably could be our new normal with climate change. With increasing temperatures, new pathogens, trade in wildlife, this has been predicted for a long time. And at the same time, we're saying that we're all mobilizing, and actually there's a lot of cross-party proactive action. What can we learn from this that we could apply to the larger existential problem that is climate change?
Okay. The man there in the dark blue shirt. Yes, you.
Also, social factors are very important here. Since the outbreak, I've seen a spike in racism on social media, public transport. My friends have been marginalised. And we had the attack yesterday on an Asian man. And I'd like to ask, what is the government doing to stop this racist rhetoric? And also the same government that failed on the Brexit hate wash from the media. So what are you going to do about that?
Okay, let me take a question from the back. Yes, the man in the glasses.
I think we as a community can play a really big part. It's not just down to the NHS and the health professionals.
Yeah.
We should be looking out for our neighbours, elderly, vulnerable people that we know. We should step up and help them out as best we can. I think that's really important.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you about some of this, but let me just get around the rest of the panel. Tim.
On the point about the NHS, I agree with all the points that are being made. But I also want to pick on what Margaret said about how this crisis is probably going to expose weaknesses that already exist. And in the case of the NHS, for instance, readers to my newspaper, The Telegraph, report difficulties getting through on the 111 number, difficulties getting a call back. There's the question of will GPs be doing visits, because GPs have stopped in many parts of the country doing home visits for a very long time. A&E is already overcrowded. And then you have the problem of people being in hospitals at the moment who should not be in hospitals. They should be in social care. It's not just an NHS problem, it's also a social care problem. And listening to all the agreement on the panel, it's fantastic. But as a lady in the audience suggested, I'm rather intrigued as to why we don't see more of this. Surely there are some problems in our society which are indeed non-partisan, and it would be nice to hear this kind of tone and this kind of working together. If only we could have this blitz spirit when it came to the environment or our schools or our hospitals.
Margaret, let me take you back to the original question. How do you expect an already strained NHS to cope, given 1 in 12 NHS posts are vacant and healthcare professionals would need to self-isolate for a fortnight if exposed? That's the original question.
Well, I think one of the other things that all of this is going to do, first of all, is going to make us look at other things, not just the health service, which most of us tend to think of as hospitals and GPs. But it was raised in the House yesterday in the same constructive tone. But we don't yet know what the public health budget is, or if there's going to be much of a change, much of an improvement in the public health budget. Local authorities, particularly if this gets worse, local authorities are going to be asked to play a heroic role. They already have great responsibilities for social care, which they are struggling to fulfil. So to me, one of the things that ought to come out of all of this is for us to recognise afresh the need for long-term sustained investment, and that goes directly back to the point the lady raised about climate change. The answer to all of this is to have proper long-term planning, whether it's for floods or for fevers. We've got to recognise the challenges of our society and our world and plan and prepare for them on a consistent and thorough basis, taking all the scientific advice along the way.
Layla.
I completely agree with what Margaret's just said, and I think to Tim's point about adult social care, I think there is a lot of goodwill in the House and across parties to work on this, but it is a Conservative majority government with a big majority, and during the election I remember Boris Johnson saying that within the first 100 days he would convene a cross-party commission to look at this intractable problem and to help us find a solution. It's day 84 today, and we still haven't seen that. So I guess my plea would be to the government, well, you need to show some leadership, because that is how governments work. The governments produce this stuff, and then Parliament will engage with it. But the government has to initiate it, and I really hope that we will get on and solve some of these big issues, because it can't wait any longer.
And Matt, do you want to answer some of the questions that were put by members of the audience? I mean, the lady over there was talking about people coming into the country, for example.
Well, yes, I'll answer as many as I can. I agree on the point on social care, and we will fulfil that manifesto commitment. The point about people coming into the country, I've been asked about this a lot. And the thing is that if this virus becomes established around the world, then there is no way of stopping it getting to Britain eventually. So the decision that we had was, do you try to shut ourselves off as a nation and delay it? And if it does go pandemic in the rest of the world, it is inevitable that it would come here. Or do you try to keep as much normal life as possible and tackle it by finding those who do come into the country and are then symptomatic? So you rightly got a leaflet saying that if you got a symptom, you should call 111. And if you'd got a symptom, no doubt you would have called 111. And lots of people did, and that's how we found many of the cases. There was one country in Europe that chose to stop the flights, and that was Italy. And they became the European epicenter of this epidemic. And in a way, that really demonstrated to me how we must follow the science. You know, of course, there are pressures on me to do things that people that feel intuitively that they're right, and I totally understand where you're coming from on this. but we've got to follow the science and the epidemiology. And our Chief Medical Officer, I want to have a shout out to Chris Whitty, absolutely brilliant scientist. He is, and the voice of calm reason, he is one of the most experienced epidemiologists in the world. And he said to me, look, we can, if we stop the flights, with all the consequences that brings, it would only delay the arrival of this disease here by a matter of days, but it would also make it much harder for us to get the medicines into this country that we need, because many of them are produced abroad.
And what about checking people's temperature at the airport, that kind of thing?
Checking the temperature doesn't have an effect, and the reason is you get loads of false positives. You get lots of people who have a temperature and it's not for coronavirus, and so you end up spending huge amounts of resources and not spotting the people. And the Americans tried checking temperatures. It may have reassured people. It has had no impact on the spread of the virus there, and the Italians also did the temperature checking. So I hear all these things, and instinctively I agree with many of them. It's a bit like the point about the mass gatherings. I understand why it seems intuitive that that's the right thing to do. But the judgment that I made with the Prime Minister right at the start of this is we're going to listen very hard to the scientists. We're going to think our way through this problem as a country, and we're going to try to have the very best possible response despite the pressures, and then it's incumbent on us to explain why we're taking the approach that we are.
OK, before we carry on, I just want to tell you about next week, because it's budget week, as I'm sure you know. Matt, we will be in West Bromwich, and the following week we're in Weston-super-Mare. So if you want to be in the audience, call 0330 123 9988, or you can go to the Question Time website and you can follow the instructions there. And who knows where we will be with this whole story next week or the week after. We will find out. Let me take another question now from Chris Belton.
Thank you. How will the government ensure that providers of adult social care are sufficiently resourced to respond to the demands of coronavirus?
Now, you touched a little bit on that, but this is something that a lot of people have been asking about. Actually, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Matt. I realise obviously you can deal with all these questions in some shape or form. Layla, do you want to kick us off on this? Because it's obviously clearly a concern.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is probably the thing that worries me the most in my own family, and who is going to be there to look after the elder generation, especially as there's about 1 in 10 jobs to fill in that sector. I think it's 122,000 people are needed. And if, you know, at any one time 20% of them go off sick, then who's going to fill in the gaps? And I think this is why we needed to solve this earlier. And I know you wouldn't start from here, and we have to do our best moving forward. And of course, it's going to be people covering for people at a time like this. Same with the NHS. In the end, it's going to be the doctors, the nurses, it's going to be care staff who are going to cover for other care staff and burn themselves out, and they will rise to the challenge, I have absolutely no doubt. And I thank them from the bottom of my heart, and I'm sure others would too, for what they are going to do. But nevertheless, we need to solve this problem as soon as possible. And I very much hope that this is the wake-up call that our country needs for issues like adult social care, also climate change, also the others, because we can't wait.
Chris, can I ask, do you work in social care?
I do, yes.
So what do you do, and what are your concerns?
I work within a care centre for older people, people with dementia, but I'm also concerned about people living at home, perhaps on their own or with carers who may be elderly themselves. And it is about the number of support staff who can help those people, but I would imagine that the people that run these services are also saying we can't do it without additional financial resources. Yeah. So I think that's a key issue as well.
Yeah. And so in your care centre, are you having conversations about if a certain number of you, I mean, the government's talked about a worst case scenario, 1 in 5, I think, is it, falling ill, about what you would do, how you would look after the people that you care for in such a situation?
I think there are often crises within care centres brought on by different things. This is probably the most challenging, and I think people are just waiting, knowing that they will respond in some way, providing they're well enough. And if they're not well enough, that their colleagues will do it on their behalf.
Right, so you just step in and do your best. Margaret?
Well, I was just thinking, it goes back actually to what the gentleman at the back said. In the end, I fear, that if it does get bad, we are going to rely on people to volunteer to help others, and we are going to rely on a sense of community and everybody looking out for each other. And actually, although this is a terrible and worrying situation, I rather like the idea that help and cooperation and friendliness and people being nice to each other for a change may spread.
Talking of cooperation, because one of the suggestions that come from the government is for doctors, nurses who have retired to come back in to help. Is there anyone here in that situation who might consider... Yes, you in the front here. Hang on, we'll just get a microphone to you. Just wait 1 second. Yeah, so you're an ex-nurse, ex-doctor?
I'm a retired staff nurse. I retired 15 years ago. And I just feel that I wouldn't feel very comfortable after being away for so long, working back in the workplace. And then there's also a question of registration. I've given up my registration, so that would need to be taken care of as well.
And you'd have to train for that?
Well, there is a back to nursing course. Yes, you would have to do a back to nursing course.
So is it something that appeals to you, or does it just seem impractical?
Not at my age, you know.
No, OK. Well, Xand, I mean, you haven't been a practicing doctor for a while.
Yeah. So I haven't. I spent 10 years working in the NHS, but I've not practiced for 10 years, and no one has contacted me yet to demand my services.
A tap on the
shoulder.
shoulder.
I could always swap in as my identical twin brother, who is frontline NHS staff, and he might be grateful for that. But I think I totally echo what you're saying. It is enormously. You don't have to have been out of practice very long to be quite de-skilled. I think the idea of a dad's army of retired healthcare professionals is, it's quite charming, it's quite British. I do think that there is an enormous role for individuals with expertise to provide help and care in their communities, their family members. I would certainly be prepared to step up on that. But the issue of registration, of terms of reference, responsibility, insurance, payment, all these things are pretty complicated. And it feels to me like that as the backbone of the response is not going to be a significant contribution. I would say, I think a couple of people have raised this idea, and Margaret raised it so eloquently, of us helping each other. This epidemic demonstrates one thing incredibly clearly, that we are all as vulnerable as the most vulnerable people among us. And when you look across the Atlantic, you see a group of people, 30 million Americans with no insurance, with no access to adequate healthcare, and many of them in precarious employment. We have a much better social safety net, and we have a much better healthcare system. We should treasure it, because those are the things that keep us safe.
On the point about social care funding, I don't want to break up this kumbaya moment, but it should be remembered
kumbaya moment? Is that what you're calling it?
All three parties have been in power, and they have all failed to tackle the basic issue of the funding formula for social care, which is why it's in the position it is, and that includes the Lib Dems, who were once in a coalition government. So they take responsibility for that as well. And one reason why they have failed to do that is because budget cuts, by the way, austerity, which was passed on to local government, which is where so many sacrifices were made. Also, local governments couldn't raise taxes unless they had a referendum, so many of them chose not to do it, so again, didn't have the funds to do it. But also, politicians are reluctant to ask us to sell our property or in some way after we've passed on to use that property to finance our own care. So the reason why the money isn't there is because this issue has been dodged. On the point about voluntarism and stepping up, people, of course, do that all the time already. And people do that by caring for their relatives as it is. I've been thinking about this crisis from a Christian perspective. And it strikes me that back in the dim, distant past, in sort of the medieval era, whenever something awful like this happened, people always assumed that it was a punishment from God. Western society has changed, and increasingly the way we theologically think about disasters like this is it's a test of us. When one asks, where is God in this scenario, it's in whether or not we step up and do our duty. So this is awful, people are worried, and we'll get through it, I'm sure, but look upon it also as a test of us as individuals. And I think right now it feels as though we're passing that test.
So, Matt, just picking up on two of the things that have been said here. The concerns about who is going to look after those who can't look after themselves in a social care setting, for example. And then this idea of getting back, I mean, Dan calls it a dad's army, very uncharitably, I'm sure, of doctors and nurses. So on that point,
what do you mean slightly?
But on that point, first of all, are you considering changing registration or relaxing the rules so that doctors and nurses can come back in more easily?
Yes. So we do want people who are qualified, but also especially those who have very recent experience to be able to come back in. So we're going to change the rules around registration that were raised and make that easier, and also make it easier to volunteer, because volunteers, to the point about the community having a role to play, people volunteering to help, for instance in social care, is incredibly important. But you've got to make sure that you get the skill set right, so that treatment is safe and people are looked after. So voluntarism and people making a voluntary effort is really, really important and will be one part of the response, but it can by no means be the whole part. I'm also the Secretary of State for social care. And getting the response right in social care is absolutely vital to this. Not least because one of the facets of this virus is that it is the impact on you is highly correlated with age. One of the saving graces is that children appear not to have any symptoms except in a rare number of cases, but it does have a particularly bad impact on people either with pre-existing health conditions or who are older.
So now, what are you going to do when the carers?
So we are putting more money in, and there's an increase in local authority budgets that's coming at the end of this month, so they can plan for that now, and making sure that resource is there. That's important, but so too the staff. I'm sure exactly as you said. It's particularly important in social care, of course, and in a residential setting where many of the residents themselves will be frail and older. So this is a particular concern. We've got more guidance for you, sir, coming out next week. It's something we're working incredibly hard on. And on the longer term point...
Yeah. Yes, because Boris Johnson said he had a plan ready to go on the steps of Downing Street.
It is best done on a cross-party basis. I think actually the spirit of this panel is a good one in which to take forward changes to social care. My view is that the reason it hasn't been cracked under governments of all colours over the last 20 years has been that it's been a failure of political economy rather than a failure of policy making.
But I'll also point out, we had choices. And in elections, Liberal Democrats put forward things like a penny on the pound on income tax to go directly into the NHS and adult social care. So I reject that it's a case that we haven't been brave enough to ask. But I really hope that this cross-party commission is going to come up with how do we sustainably longer-term fund this issue? Because unless we do this cross-party, it's going to be a 10, 20-year endeavour. And I'm deeply concerned that it's going to get dodged again and it's going to get kicked into the long grass.
Well, I will. Let's meet up.
All right.
Let's meet up when we're back, and the offer's there for you as well, Margaret. And let's take this forward.
We actually had a cross-party commission when Andy Burnham was Secretary of State, and it got very close, we thought, to agreement.
Yes.
And then David Cameron pulled the plug, and we haven't had a successful one since.
Right. Now I can see quite a few of you have got your hands up. I'm going to move on. If I may, because there was, as you take your hands down, I'm sorry, simply because the question I'm going to come to next, lots of you asked about this as well, so I don't think I'd be doing the right thing by if we didn't come to it. So, I'd like to hear from Dale Fairless, please.
Has Priti Patel's position as Home Secretary become untenable after the recent claims of bullying?
Actually, Margaret, do you want to kick us off on that?
Well, it clearly hasn't become untenable because she's still there.
But do you think she's going to last?
But I think it's getting close. I think the thing that is, I mean, she's clearly looking at the range of. I mean, this isn't somebody I know well at all, but looking at the range of comments, it does seem to me that she's somebody who can be very charming to important colleagues around her, and they all think she's absolutely great. But if you're not an important colleague, it may not be quite so easy. And I think the thing that is difficult for her is that there is a pattern and there's a whole set of different departments. If it was one department, you might think that was it.
It's in three of the 4 government departments she's worked in.
One thing I do think is really important to say, because it gets very misleading. In my experience, which is reasonably substantial, there's nothing civil servants like more than a minister who knows what they want, and nothing they hate more than a minister who doesn't know what they want. So the notion that somehow the civil service doesn't like ministers who have policies that they want to pursue and know how they want to go about it, it's just rubbish. Now, of course, if what the minister wants is unrealistic or unlawful or something, I appreciate it may be difficult.
Tim?
This is more like it. We can go back to tearing lumps out of each other.
Less kumbaya.
Exactly. 2 things I think are really going on here. One is it feels like there is a partisan political briefing operation against Priti Patel taking place. The second thing is that there is a broad context, which is that the government has got an awful lot it wants to do in the next year, and probably the Home Office has got more than any other department's got to do, including things like tackling knife crime and introducing an entirely new immigration system in time for the proper Brexit when it finally comes. And so the Home Secretary is probably sort of cracking the whip and trying to get civil servants to do things which in some cases they possibly don't feel they have the resources to do, the time to do. And unfortunately, some of the civil servants, one suspects, don't actually want to do some of those things.
I mean, these allegations go back, I mean, we can't say if they're true or not, but they go back 5 years, so well before what you're talking about.
Well, that element is a he said, she said thing. If there's any kind of bullying in any department, and that would include, say, John Bercow, if he was guilty of that, that would be totally unacceptable too. If Priti Patel were guilty of that, that would be totally acceptable. What I'm saying is there is a political context to this, which is what makes me somewhat suspicious of some of the politics going on behind the scenes. She's got a lot of things that she wants to get done, and unfortunately the civil service, parts of it, have come to regard it themselves as a sort of constitutional check upon the executive, that they are there to say, you can't do this, you can't do that. Well, that's not acceptable, because whatever you think of Priti Patel, she's the elected representative of the people. The civil service is there to help her get done what the people have voted to do.
And ask...
Can I just...
And our civil service are better and more professional at doing that than almost any other civil service in the world, and respected across the world for that profession.
Under New Labour, at least one Home Secretary described the Home Office as not fit for purpose. This almost always happens. Whenever you have a radical reforming government, you always get civil servants saying they don't know what they're doing and we've got to try and stop.
Let's hear from the audience. Lots of hands up. Yes, the woman here in the front.
I was just going to say, this lady has had problems in 3 departments, but also...
Well, they're allegations.
Allegations.
We can't come to a conclusion about it.
And also,
she denies
she had to leave the government previously because she was just talking to the Israeli government or something like that. So it's not the first time something's been not just allegation.
No.
Yeah.
The woman there in the black and white top.
Could it be that certain members of the civil service are using accusations of bullying to hide behind when in fact it may be laziness, resistance to change or incompetence?
Okay, and the man there in the blue sweater.
Oh, hi, yeah. I just wondered whether there's an element of sexism, so that her behaviours, you know, in a man would be seen as assertive, but in Priti Patel is perhaps being interpreted as being bullying. What do the panel think about that?
Layla?
Well, first of all, I really think we need a proper investigation into this that is actually independent. My understanding... And as with anyone who faces allegations like this at work, we would expect that the right process is followed. But my concern is that that independent investigation is going to be done by the Cabinet Office, and I don't actually think that that's very independent. I think it really needs to be properly independent. But what it does speak to, in my view, and let's leave Priti Patel to one side, because there is a broader bullying culture that is emanating from number 10. And we've seen Dominic Cummings firing large numbers of special advisors In fact, my understanding is that one of them is suing Number 10 for wrongful dismissal. And I believe that, obviously, bullying and harassment has no place in any organisation. Number 10 should not be exempt from that. But you also set the tone from government. You set the tone for not just the civil service, but actually the whole of the country. And we've been talking today about compassion and pulling together, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we just were a bit nicer to each other? Well, I'm sorry to say that also applies to the way people treat each other in government, in parliament, and in our institutions, because it matters and it filters into society. And if we're serious about that, then we should be really worried and take these allegations against Priti Patel and others in government very, very seriously. We deserve better than them.
I couldn't agree more with Layla. I have to say, one of the things, you raised the issue of sexism, one of the things that does concern me in the conversation about Priti Patel, she is, at least to many people on the left, one of the least likeable members of the cabinet. Her support for the death penalty, her wavering support for the death penalty, the overall agenda at the Home Office seems particularly vicious and unpleasant. And so there is a tone around the conversation around her dismissal which is equally unpleasant. In general, the nastiness of most of the rhetoric around the party political positions on social media and in general, it does trickle down. I work a lot in schools, I film a lot with children, and we are seeing a rise in bullying and a rise in nastiness. And I think coming out of Number 10 for sure, but also coming out of an adult class that is increasingly divided. And so I think in expressing concern about Priti Patel, of course there should be an investigation. I think it's also really important that the people that don't like her and are concerned about these allegations do not then adopt that tone themselves. That's something.
The question is, has her position become untenable?
No, until there's an investigation, I don't. I mean, I'm not in the Home Office, so until there's an investigation, I think it's impossible to say, but it is concerning.
Well, so let's talk about this investigation in a moment, Matt, but let me just ask you first, given what's been said on the panel here, and given the allegations about Priti Patel go back 5 years, when did you first hear about concerns about her behaviour?
When I turned on my TV on a Saturday and saw the resignation of one of the civil servants.
In the Home Office?
Yes, I know.
So you never heard, nothing was heard by you prior to that?
Absolutely not. And I know Priti Patel well. I've worked with her a lot. And she's determined. She certainly wants to get her agenda through. And I think that's what we want in a Home Secretary. And she is, in my experience, in all the conversations and dealings I've had with her and her team, she's always been courteous and polite and straightforward.
So are you surprised by the allegations and so many of them?
Yes, I am. And what's vital here is that we have a investigation that is underway. It has Sir Alex Allen, who is independent. And the crucial
and can I just check, is that into the allegations from all three departments? Or
yes, it's into all of the facts, to get straight to the facts, because I don't think that what we should be doing is jumping to conclusions before we've got the facts. And I think, though, that the agenda that Priti is pursuing is probably closer to the views of the British people on home affairs in terms of putting in place controls on immigration and more police than any Home Secretary for many decades, and I support her very strongly in doing that.
But Matt, don't you think, I mean, today's World Book Day, right? So one of my favourite books is Harry Potter, and in it is, I think, something worth bearing in mind, a quote from Sirius Black, who was himself bullied. And if you want to judge a man, or indeed in this case a woman, then look at how they treat their inferiors, not their peers. And in this case, I do think if I were Priti Patel and I was hearing these allegations, and you are hearing these as well, are you really so comfortable backing her to the hilt in the way that you are? There are other people who could drive through your mandate that you want to get through, and I completely disagree with a lot of it. The Home Office, by the way, in my constituency surgery, is that hostile environment still exists. Windrush. We've got EU citizens now. Actually, this is a department that desperately does need leadership, but needs a lot of compassion and needs a lot of change, but not in this direction. Are you really that comfortable backing her in the way that you are?
Well, I would certainly be uncomfortable with taking the position, as you seem to have done, of presuming her guilty before you've seen the facts.
The man in the check shirt there.
Yes, thank you. Do we really need a long, expensive, drawn-out independent investigation for claims that she allegedly may have shouted at someone 3-4 years ago?
What, because you think it doesn't matter, or because you've already made your mind up?
Well, not that it doesn't matter. I think there's more important issues that we could be looking at as opposed to someone allegedly shouting at someone. There's a lot of anti-Semitism claims in the Labour Party. That deserves an independent investigation.
It is. Well, it is. It's being investigated by the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
It exactly is, but is that the same as shouting at someone a few years ago? I'm not sure it is.
It's the man here in the glasses.
Yeah, can I just check what the consequence would be if she's found guilty of the allegations? Would she be expected to resign, or would she retain her position?
Well, that's a matter for the Prime Minister, but we haven't reached that because what's important is to get to the bottom of allegations. It's perfectly reasonable to investigate allegations. What is unreasonable is people who disagree with her policies saying that she should be got rid of before that has even happened.
It's highly ironic that the Home Secretary is not getting due justice. That doesn't seem quite fair.
I don't think anyone's saying that.
No one's
I
saying that.
think Layla very clearly said that she wanted an independent investigation.
There is a presumption of guilt in this conversation.
I don't think there is at all. I didn't say that, and Layla didn't say that either.
No,
We both said, I said I don't know what's happening in the Foreign Office, but I do think it's very important to investigate. And I also said it's really important that we do not create a culture of bullying against Priti Patel, no matter what we think of some of her odious policies. I was very, very clear about that.
Let me just hear a little bit more from the audience. Yes, the man in the front here.
So given a number of senior ministers have already shown their support for Priti Patel, and sort of, is a ministerial investigation then truly independent?
Exactly.
Well, so it's not a
by the Cabinet Office.
It isn't a ministerial investigation. It's an investigation by the Cabinet Office with the independent advisor to the Cabinet Office, Alex Allen. So that is independent of ministers.
And let that investigation go ahead. Imagine an alternative scenario, which is simply that allegations were made and immediately the Prime Minister dropped her. That would set a dreadful precedent at the very, very beginning of this government. The message it would send to the civil service is, if you don't like the policies of your minister, make a complaint and get rid of them. That's not the right precedent.
But hold on. You're saying that these civil servants don't like the policies. How do you know that? You can't know that.
Well, hold on.
So this is actually why an investigation is so important. The question I was asking is, why is Boris Johnson and you so comfortable backing her to the hilt in the way that you are? Surely the thing to say is, let's put it to an investigation, but why then go out and say, she's wonderful, she's always been lovely to me? I don't think that's relevant.
So she's supposed to disappear and sort of go into a purdah for the next 6 months and just hide from the public while the investigation goes on? She's got to do her job, and of course the Prime Minister has to show confidence.
Yeah, but can we just stop suggesting that civil servants are somehow, you know, constructing some kind of conspiracy? We've spent the first part of this programme talking about how we need to treat each other with respect and listen to experts. Actually, there are very many expert people in the civil service that are well worth listening to.
And
they deserve our respect.
Responsible for the hostile policy and the Windrush policies, which you have also attacked.
We are almost out of time. In a sentence, Matt, please.
It is vital. It is vital in this country that people are innocent and not presumed guilty until the facts are established. But the final thing that is so critical is that civil servants, medics, the NHS, ministers work together incredibly closely on this great crisis of coronavirus that we were talking about for most of the programme. And it shows that this is a completely separate question. And the way that ministers and civil servants can and do work together right across government has just been shown in an exemplary fashion on the coronavirus issue and is continuing 24/7 to keep people safe.
OK, our time is up, I'm afraid. The agreement lasted for quite a lot of the programme and it's just sort of vanished, but we enjoyed it a while, isn't it? OK, our hour is up. Next week we are in West Bromwich, as I said earlier, and the following week we are in Weston-super-Mare. So call 0330 123 9988 if you'd like to be in the audience, or go to the Question Time website and you can follow the instructions there. And if you want to have your say on tonight's topics, you want to carry on this conversation, you can join Adrian, Charles and guests on Question Time Extra Time, which as always is on 5 Live right now. But for now, thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much to all of you for your points and your questions. And, of course, to you at home for watching and for listening from Tunbridge Wells. Bye-bye.
Talking more about coronavirus and this week's biggest stories, newscast follows in just a moment here on BBC One.